You're nothing, Carter! I am a soldier. Justice wins! Under Army protection, now!
The courtroom in the small town of Franklin, Ohio, hummed with tension on a crisp October morning in 2025. The old oak benches creaked under the weight of a packed gallery, locals, reporters, and a handful of veterans in faded service caps, their eyes sharp with quiet anticipation. At the center of it all sat James Carter, a 38-year-old Black Army Ranger, his dress uniform replaced by a plain gray suit that did little to hide the strength in his broad shoulders. His wrists, free of cuffs but still marked by their pressure, rested calmly on the table before him. He was a man who had faced death in deserts and mountains, yet here, in a place meant to uphold justice, he was on trial for a crime he didn't commit. The air was thick with whispers, but James' silence was louder, a steady force that seemed to unsettle the room more than any outburst could. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Walsh, a white cop in his late 40s, leaned back in his chair, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. His smirk was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. To him, James wasn't a war hero, a father, or a man who had saved countless lives. He was just another black man in the defendant's chair, and that was enough to fuel Walsh's contempt. The judge, Harold Grayson, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for running a tight courtroom, sat high on the bench. His gray hair was thinning, his eyes sharp but distant, as if he'd already made up his mind before the gavel fell. And beside James sat his attorney, Robert Klein, a soft-spoken man in his early 40s, his suit neatly pressed but his demeanor lacking the fire needed to match the storm brewing in the room. The case was simple on paper. James Carter, accused of assaulting an Officer Walsh during a routine traffic stop. But nothing about this was routine. The stop had been anything but standard, a pretext rooted in Walsh's prejudice, a fact that hung unspoken in the air. The gallery, a mix of curious townsfolk and skeptical reporters, leaned forward, waiting for James to defend himself, to shout, to rage. But he gave them nothing. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a wall, unyielding and heavy with purpose. To Walsh, it was a challenge. "Look at him," Walsh muttered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Big Army guy, but no spine when it counts." The words stung, not because James reacted, but because he didn't. Klein shifted nervously, his pen pausing mid-note, but Judge Grayson's gavel stayed silent, letting the insult linger like smoke. The trial began with Klein's opening statement, a rehearsed plea for fairness that felt thin against the weight of the room's bias. Walsh, sitting with the prosecutor, exchanged a quick grin, as if the outcome was already decided. They saw this as a formality, a quick conviction to tidy up the narrative they'd crafted. But James sat still, his eyes fixed forward, his hands steady. His composure was a silent rebuke, a refusal to play their game. And that refusal, though misunderstood by some, was the first spark of a fire that would soon consume the courtroom. The tension built as the morning wore on. Walsh, emboldened by Grayson's leniency and Klein's restraint, couldn't resist pushing further. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You think that uniform makes you special, Carter? In here, you're nothing." The words were a blade, meant to draw blood, and a few in the gallery gasped. A woman in the second row clutched her purse, her lips tight with anger. Two men in the back, their faces hardened by years of small-town loyalty to men like Walsh, chuckled softly. Klein froze, his voice catching as he started to object, but Grayson's gavel tapped weakly, a half-hearted call for order that did nothing to rein in Walsh's venom. James turned his head slowly, meeting Walsh's gaze for the first time. His eyes were calm, unflinching, carrying a weight that made the officer's smirk falter for a split second. The room felt a shift, subtle but undeniable. James' silence wasn't surrender, it was a warning. The gallery grew still, the laughter dying out, replaced by an uneasy quiet. Even those who had smirked moments ago sensed something larger at play. The veterans in the back, their faces etched with the kind of wisdom only combat brings, exchanged knowing glances. "That's not weakness," one whispered. "That's a man holding ground." The air grew heavier as Walsh, unable to stand James' composure, pushed further. "Typical," he spat, loud enough for the jury to hear. "Another thug in a uniform, thinking he's above the law." The insult landed like a slap, and the gallery split. Some recoiled in disgust. Others nodded in quiet agreement. A young reporter scribbled furiously, her pen scratching like a pulse. James remained still, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed on a point beyond Walsh. That stillness wasn't indifference. It was power, the kind that comes from knowing the truth will outlast lies. Then it happened. Walsh, fueled by rage and emboldened by the room's inaction, stood and crossed the courtroom in 3 heavy steps. His boots echoed on the polished floor, each step a challenge. He stopped in front of James and shoved him hard in the shoulder. It wasn't enough to knock him over, but that wasn't the point. The shove was meant to humiliate, to strip James of dignity in front of the jury, the judge, and the town. The gallery erupted in gasps. A man in the front row stood, his fists clenched, while others whispered in shock or nervous amusement. Klein half rose, his voice trembling as he called out, "Your Honor, this is outrageous." But Grayson hesitated, his gavel hovering, his eyes darting between Walsh and James. For a long, unbearable moment, the judge did nothing, letting the act stand as if it were just another moment in the proceedings. Walsh smirked, leaning closer. "Where's that army toughness now, Carter?" he taunted. James didn't flinch. He straightened in his chair, his body like granite, his eyes locked on Walsh's. His hands, resting on the table, tightened slightly, the veins in his forearms standing out a subtle sign of the storm he held back. The room felt it, the shift from spectacle to something deeper. The laughter stopped. The whispers faded. Even those who had cheered Walsh's arrogance now sat uneasy, realizing they weren't watching a man broken. They were watching a man who could break everything but chose not to. Grayson finally tapped his gavel, his voice weak. "Order in the court." But the words lacked force, and the imbalance in the room was palpable. James wasn't just on trial for a fabricated assault. His very identity, black, soldier, hero, was being weighed and found wanting by a system that seemed to favor Walsh's badge over truth. Klein, shaken, scribbled notes, his hands unsteady. The veterans in the back leaned forward, their murmurs low but firm. "He's waiting," one said. "Something's coming." And something was. Outside the Franklin County Courthouse, word of the shove spread like wildfire. Reporters gathered on the steps, their cameras flashing as they whispered about a war hero humiliated in open court. A small crowd formed, locals and passers-by drawn by the growing buzz. The story was no longer confined to the courtroom. It was spilling into the streets, carried by phones and hushed conversations. Inside, Walsh mistook James' silence for defeat, leaning closer with a sneer. "No backbone, huh? Army didn't teach you to stand up for yourself." The words were meant to provoke, but James' eyes held steady, a quiet storm gathering behind them. Then, without warning, the courtroom doors burst open. The sharp cadence of boots on marble cut through the tension like a blade. A unit of military police, their uniforms crisp and their rifles slung, marched in with precision. At their head was Major Elizabeth Torres, her presence commanding the room in a way Grayson's gavel never could. The air shifted instantly. Walsh's smirk vanished, his face paling as he turned to see the soldiers. Reporters scrambled for their cameras, flashes popping like gunfire. The gallery buzzed with whispers, some standing to get a better view. Grayson stiffened, his gavel frozen mid-air, his authority suddenly dwarfed by the disciplined force before him. Torres' voice was low but carried like thunder. "James Carter, we are here under direct orders from the Department of the Army." The words hit the room like a shockwave. This wasn't a request. It was a declaration that rewrote the trial's narrative in an instant. The military police fanned out, two taking positions behind James not as captors, but as protectors. Their presence spoke volumes. James wasn't alone, and he wasn't abandoned. Walsh swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. Moments ago, he had shoved a man he thought powerless. Now, the ground beneath him was slipping away. Outside, the crowd swelled, chants rising faintly through the courthouse windows. "Justice for Carter." The words echoed, carried by veterans and locals who had heard enough. Reporters streamed live, their voices feverish as they reported a Black Army Ranger defended by his own. Inside, Grayson cleared his throat, struggling to regain control, but the room no longer belonged to him. Torres gave James a curt nod, her eyes steady. "You are under our protection," she said. "You will not stand here alone." The gallery felt the weight of her words. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. A veteran in the back nodded, his jaw tight with pride. James, still silent, returned Torres' nod, his calm unshaken. His restraint wasn't weakness. It was a signal, a promise that truth was coming. And it did. A new figure rose from the benches, a man in dress blues, his chest heavy with medals. Captain Michael Hayes, a broad-shouldered soldier in his 50s, hadn't been scheduled to testify. But as his eyes met James, recognition flashed across his face. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I know this man. I served with him in Afghanistan. When my platoon was ambushed, when we thought we were done for, James Carter carried 2 of my men to safety under fire. He saved us all. I wouldn't be here without him." The words landed like a grenade, shattering the room's fragile balance. The gallery gasped, some leaning forward, others clutching hands in disbelief. Walsh, caught off guard, shouted, "He's lying. They're all covering for him." But his voice cracked, his desperation clear. The military police stepped forward, their presence silencing his outburst. Grayson's gavel fell, but it was weak, drowned by the truth Hayes had laid bare. Outside, the chants grew louder, the crowd now a sea of signs and voices demanding justice. Then came the final blow. Torres stepped forward, a sealed folder in her hands, stamped with the Army's insignia. She placed it before Grayson with a salute. "Your Honor, this file has been cleared for disclosure. It concerns Officer Daniel Walsh." The judge hesitated, his hands trembling as he opened it. The pages revealed a history Walsh had buried. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and intimidation, all swept under the rug by a system that protected its own. But the most damning evidence was new proof that Walsh had fabricated the assault charge against James, manipulating reports and coercing witnesses to paint a hero as a criminal. The courtroom erupted. Veterans pounded the benches, their outrage shaking the walls. Reporters shouted into phones, their words racing across the country. Outside, the chants grew deafening. "Justice for Carter." Walsh stammered, his face ashen. "It's a setup. You can't prove anything." But the file, opened before Grayson, told a different story. The judge, sweating now, closed it with a trembling hand. "This court cannot proceed," he said, his voice unsteady. "This case is referred to federal authorities." The words shifted the trial's foundation, escalating it beyond Franklin's small courtroom to a national stage. Weeks later, the federal courthouse in Cincinnati was a different world. Judge Eleanor Thompson, a woman in her 60s known for her unyielding fairness, presided with a presence that commanded respect. The gallery was packed: veterans, activists, reporters, and locals, their faces a mix of hope and skepticism. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Nguyen led the prosecution, her voice sharp as she laid out Walsh's crimes: assault, falsifying evidence, and a pattern of racial abuse. Video of Walsh's courtroom outburst played on a screen, his slurs and shove replayed for the jury. The evidence was undeniable, a puzzle snapping into place. James took the stand for the first time, his voice calm but resonant. "Walsh mocked my service, my skin, my life," he said. "But I didn't answer with hate. I've fought for this country, for all of us. I wasn't going to let him take that from me." His words, simple and true, held the room captive. Then came Sergeant David Lopez, another veteran who had served with James. "This man saved my squad in Iraq," he said, his voice steady. "He's the reason I'm alive. That's who he is." The testimony was a thunderclap, stripping away Walsh's lies and revealing James as a hero. Outside, the story had become a national firestorm. News vans lined the streets, headlines screaming, "Black Army Ranger faces racist attack in court." Veterans rallied, holding vigils with flags held high. Social media buzzed with "Justice for Carter," and editorials questioned whether the system could deliver justice when prejudice ran so deep. Inside, Thompson kept the trial focused, her gavel cutting through any attempt to deflect. When Walsh's attorney tried to dismiss his actions as a bad day, she shut it down. "This court will not excuse hate," she said, her voice like steel. On the final day, Walsh was brought in, his bravado gone, his wrists cuffed. The jury had reached a verdict, and the room held its breath. In a last act of desperation, Walsh leapt to his feet, his voice ragged. He's just a black man in a uniform. He's nothing. The words were a final, ugly gasp, and the gallery froze. James stood slowly, his presence filling the room. "No," he said, his voice steady as stone. "I am a soldier, an American soldier. And today, justice wins." The words landed with a force that silenced Walsh, his defiance crumbling. Thompson delivered the verdict. "Daniel Walsh, you are guilty on all counts. You are stripped of your badge and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with no early release." The gavel fell, sharp and final. The gallery exhaled, some weeping, others nodding in quiet triumph. Veterans stood, saluting James silently. Outside, the crowd erupted, not in wild celebration but in unified resolve, chanting for change. Reporters captured every moment, knowing they were witnessing history. Walsh was led away, his head bowed, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. James didn't gloat. He placed a hand on Lopez's shoulder, a silent thank you, then turned to the gallery, offering a nod that spoke of humility and strength. The trial was over, but its impact was just beginning. Across the country, James' story sparked debates in living rooms and town halls. It wasn't just about one man. It was about a system forced to confront its flaws, about a nation reckoning with what justice truly meant. In the weeks that followed, Walsh's sentence was upheld, his badge a relic of a past he could no longer hide. James returned to his life, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. When asked why he never struck back, he said, "Justice isn't won with fists. It's won with truth and patience." His words echoed, a reminder that real strength lies not in rage, but in integrity. This story isn't just James Carter's. It's a mirror for all of us, asking whether we'll stand against injustice or let it fester. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below, especially about the role of violence and prejudice in our lives. Should James have fought back, or was his restraint the true victory? Let's hear your voice.